The shuttle bay of the GSC Vengeance hummed with activity as another batch of fresh recruits stumbled out of the transport vessel. Most were the usual suspects, towering Krillian warriors with their forearms and chitinous armor, graceful Etherian telepaths whose translucent skin shimmered with inner light, and stocky Terran engineers whose cybernetic implants glowed softly in the dim lighting. Then there was her, Sarah. Chen stepped off the shuttle with the kind of quiet confidence that made seasoned veterans take notice, though not always for the right reasons. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, she looked like a child among giants. Her standard-issue uniform hung loosely on her small frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail that somehow made her appear even younger than her 22 years. The other recruits barely glanced at her as they formed up in the bay. Why would they? She was human after all, one of the newer species to join the Galactic Defense Coalition. Humans had only been part of the Alliance for 37 years, and while they had proven useful in certain technical roles, they were hardly considered warrior material. Sergeant Vextar, a massive Krillian whose scarred carapace told stories of 100 battles, began his usual intimidation routine. His forearms gestured dramatically as he paced before the assembled recruits, his voice booming through the bay's speakers. "Welcome to hell, maggots. I am Sergeant Vextar, and for the next 6 months I will be the closest thing to a god you pathetic excuses for soldiers will ever encounter." His primary eyes focused on each recruit in turn, while his secondary eyes scanned for signs of weakness. Some of you think you're warriors because you dominated your home planets. Some of you think your technology makes you invincible. And some of you... His gaze settled on Sarah and a cruel smile spread across his mandibles. Some of you are here because the Coalition has quotas to fill. Snickers rippled through the group. A young Krillian recruit named Zekthos elbowed his companion and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look at the tiny human. She probably weighs less than my weapon." Sarah didn't react. She stood at attention, her expression neutral, her breathing steady. This only seemed to annoy Sergeant Vextar more. "You human," he barked, stepping closer until his towering form cast a shadow over her. "What's your name?" "Recruit Sarah Chen, sir," she replied in a clear, calm voice that carried despite its softness. "And what makes you think you belong here, Recruit Chen?" "This is the Elite Shock Corps training program. We don't have time to babysit delicate little flowers." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I passed the same entrance exams as everyone else, sir. My scores qualified me for this program." "Scores?" Vextar laughed, a harsh chittering sound. "Numbers on a screen? Let me tell you what matters here, little human. Strength matters. Speed matters.
The ability to kill without hesitation matters."
"Can you do that? Can you take a life when the moment demands it?" "If necessary, sir." The sergeant's laugh grew louder. "If necessary. Did you hear that, recruits? The human will kill if it's necessary." He turned to address the group. "Let me tell you all something about necessity. In 2 weeks, you'll face your first combat simulation. It will be based on the Battle of Kepler 442, where a single coalition squad held off an entire Zentari invasion force for 14 hours. 90% of squads fail this simulation on their first attempt. Those who fail get recycled back to basic training." He turned back to Sarah, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "I'll make you a deal, little human. If you can complete that simulation successfully, I'll personally apologize for doubting you. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll accept immediate transfer to the Clerical Corps where you belong." "Agreed?" Sarah considered this for a moment. Around her, she could feel the other recruits watching, waiting to see if the small human would break under pressure. Some looked amused, others pitying. None looked like they expected her to accept. "Agreed, sir," she said simply. Vextar's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. "Excellent. Don't worry, Chen. There's no shame in finding your proper place in the Coalition. Not everyone can be a warrior." As the recruits were dismissed to their quarters, the whispers followed Sarah down the corridor. "Did you see how tiny she is? Humans have no business in shock. Corpse. She'll wash out in a week. I heard humans are afraid of the dark. My little sister could probably take her in a fight." Sarah's assigned roommate was Lyra Shawn Wei, an Etherian whose telepathic abilities made her constantly aware of the emotions swirling around their small human companion. As they unpacked their few belongings, Lyra couldn't help but comment. "You know they're all thinking the same thing, right?" Lyra's voice carried the musical quality common to her species. "They think you're going to be the first one to break. Sarah folded her uniform with military precision. What do you think? Lyra paused, her translucent skin flickering with uncertainty. I think there's something different about you. Your mind is unusually quiet for a human. Most of your species broadcast emotions constantly, but you're like a calm lake. It's actually quite unsettling. Is that a bad thing? I'm not sure, Lyra admitted. But I've learned that still waters often run deeper than they appear. That night, as the other recruit slept, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling. She could hear Zekthos and his friends in the next room, still making jokes about the tiny human and taking bets on how long she'd last. Their laughter echoed through the thin walls. Sarah didn't mind the mockery. She'd heard worse during her childhood on New Geneva, where being small and quiet in a frontier colony meant being an easy target. She'd learned early that people's expectations could be a weapon if you knew how to use them properly. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was why she'd really joined the coalition military. It wasn't patriotism or a desire for glory. It wasn't even the educational benefits or the chance to see the galaxy. Sarah Chen had joined because she'd discovered something about herself during the entrance exams, something that had surprised even her. When pushed to her absolute limit, when faced with impossible odds and certain failure, she didn't break. She didn't panic. She didn't give up. Instead, something cold and calculating woke up inside her mind, something that analyzed every detail and found solutions where others saw only problems. The psychologist had called it extreme stress adaptation and marked it as an interesting anomaly in her file. Sarah had a different name for it, though she'd never shared it with anyone. She called it her battlefield mind, and she was curious to see what it would do when truly tested. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah smiled slightly. Let them underestimate her. Let them think she was just another weak human trying to play soldier. They'd learn the truth soon enough. The first week of training was designed to break the weak and weed out those who couldn't handle the physical demands of Shock Corps service. Sergeant Vextar pushed the recruits through grueling obstacle courses, weapons drills, and endurance runs that left even the strongest gasping for breath. Sarah surprised everyone by keeping up. Not excelling exactly, but maintaining a steady pace that got her through each challenge without collapsing. While others struggled with the alien equipment or failed to adapt to the station's variable gravity fields, she quietly observed, learned, and improved. The Krillian recruits dominated the strength-based exercises, their forearms giving them obvious advantages in climbing and lifting. The Etherians excelled at anything requiring coordination and mental focus. The few other humans in the group performed adequately in most areas, but struggled with the more exotic challenges. Sarah found her niche in unexpected places. During urban combat simulations, while others focused on overwhelming firepower or brute force approaches, she discovered angles and approaches that others missed. In technical exercises, her small size allowed her to access maintenance shafts and defensive positions that larger recruits couldn't reach. But it was during hand-to-hand combat training that the real trouble started. All right, maggots, Sergeant Vextar announced on the 7th day. Time to see how you handle real combat. You'll be paired randomly for sparring matches. No weapons, minimal protection. The fight ends when someone yields or can't continue. The pairings were announced, and Sarah found herself facing Draktor, a massive Krillian recruit who stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed at least 3 times what she did. His forearms were corded with muscle, and his natural armor plating could probably deflect small arms fire. The other recruits gathered around the training mat, many of them grinning in anticipation. This would be the moment when the little human finally learned her place. This is hardly fair, Lyra whispered to another recruit. He could seriously hurt her. Zekthos overheard and laughed. That's the point. Maybe now she'll realize she doesn't belong here. Sergeant Vextar raised his hand. Begin! Draktor charged immediately, confident that his size and strength would end the fight quickly. His forearms spread wide to grab the small human and slam her to the mat. Sarah didn't try to match his charge or stand her ground. Instead, she did something that caught everyone off guard. She dropped low and rolled directly between his legs, coming up behind him as his momentum carried him forward. Before Draktor could turn around, Sarah had jumped onto his back, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. But instead of trying to choke him, which would have been impossible given his natural armor, she did something far more unexpected. Her fingers found the nerve cluster at the base of his skull, A weakness in Krillian anatomy that she'd memorized from the xenobiology texts. She applied pressure with surgical precision, and Draktor's legs suddenly gave out beneath him. As he crashed to the mat, Sarah rolled away and came to her feet, backing toward the edge of the fighting area. Draktor struggled to stand, his motor control temporarily disrupted, confusion clear in his compound eyes. "Impossible," someone whispered. "How did she know about that nerve cluster?" "Lucky guess," Zekthos muttered, but he sounded less certain than before. Draktor finally regained his footing, his confidence shaken, but his pride demanding revenge. This time he approached more cautiously, his forearms weaving in complex patterns designed to prevent another sneak attack. Sarah watched him come, her expression calm and analytical. She was in her battlefield mind now, the cold, calculating part of her consciousness that saw every movement as data to be processed. Draktor's attack patterns, his balance points, the slight favor he showed his upper left arm due to an old injury. She cataloged it all. When he struck, it was with the speed and fury of a trained warrior. His forearms lashed out in a coordinated assault that should have overwhelmed any opponent. But Sarah wasn't there when the attacks landed. She moved with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural, never wasting energy on unnecessary motions, always positioning herself in the exact spot where his arms couldn't reach. It looked like a dance, beautiful and deadly. Sarah flowed around Draktor's attacks like water, occasionally striking pressure points and nerve clusters with pinpoint accuracy. Each touch was brief but precise, gradually wearing down his coordination and strength. The watching recruits fell silent. This wasn't the clumsy brawl they'd expected. This was something else entirely, a master class in how to defeat a superior opponent through knowledge, timing, and surgical precision. Draktor grew increasingly frustrated as his attacks failed to connect. His movements became wider, more desperate, less controlled. Sarah continued her patient work, mapping his patterns, finding openings, exploiting weaknesses he didn't even know he had. The end came suddenly. Draktor overextended on a particularly vicious strike, and Sarah stepped inside his guard. Her small fist struck 3 pressure points in rapid succession: shoulder, elbow, and wrist. Draktor's primary right arm went completely numb, throwing off his balance. As he stumbled, Sarah grabbed his wrist and used his own momentum to send him crashing to the mat. Before he could recover, she had his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that leveraged his own weight against him. "Yield," she said quietly. Draktor struggled for a moment, then realized the futility of his position. Any movement would only increase the pressure on his trapped arm. "I yield," he gasped. Sarah released him immediately and stepped back, offering her hand to help him up. Draktor stared at her for a long moment, then accepted the assistance. The training bay was completely silent. Even Sergeant Vextar seemed momentarily speechless. "How?" Draktor asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier hostility. "I have 4 arms, natural armor, twice your reach." "How did you do that?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "You assumed that because I was smaller and weaker, I would fight the same way you do. But strength and size are just tools. If you don't have those tools, you find others." "What tools?" Lyra asked, her telepathic senses picking up something unusual in Sarah's mental patterns. "Knowledge, patience, precision." Sarah looked around at the assembled recruits. "I studied every species in this program. I know where your nerve clusters are, how your joints move, what your natural blind spots are. You all fight like you're facing enemies from your own species. But real combat isn't fair, and real enemies won't fight the way you expect." Sergeant Vextar finally found his voice. "Where did you learn these techniques, Recruit Chen?" "I didn't learn them, sir. I developed them." Sarah's voice remained calm and matter-of-fact. "Humans are physically inferior to most coalition species. If we want to survive in the same universe, we have to be smarter about how we fight." The implications of her words hung in the air. This wasn't just about one small human getting lucky in a sparring match. This was about an entire species that had apparently been developing combat techniques specifically designed to defeat larger, stronger opponents. "Chen," Sergeant Vextar said slowly, "report to my office after evening chow. We need to discuss your training background in more detail." As the group dispersed for their next exercise, the whispers followed Sarah again. But this time they carried a different tone entirely. "Did you see how fast she moved? She knew exactly where to hit him. What if all humans can do that? Maybe we've been underestimating them. Sarah walked with Lyra toward the equipment lockers, her expression unchanged. Inside, though, her battlefield mind was already analyzing the new dynamics her display had created. She'd revealed capabilities that would change how others viewed her, and, by extension, how they viewed humanity. The question now was whether that would help her or hurt her when the real challenges began. Sergeant Vextar's office was a cramped space filled with commendations, weapon displays, and hollows of battles from across the galaxy. Sarah stood at attention before his desk while he reviewed her file on his terminal, occasionally clicking his mandibles in what she'd learned was a sign of deep thought. "Your records are interesting, Chen," he said finally. "Born on New Geneva, a frontier colony. Parents were mining engineers. No formal military training, no martial arts background listed anywhere. Yet you just dismantled one of my best Krillian recruits using techniques I've never seen before." "Yes, sir. I've been training soldiers for 23 years. Chen, I've seen prodigies, naturals, and gifted fighters from dozens of species. But what you did out there wasn't natural talent. That was systematic, practiced, precise. So I'll ask you again, where did you learn to fight like that?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided on honesty. "New Geneva wasn't a safe place to grow up, sir. Especially for someone my size. I had to learn to defend myself against people bigger and stronger than me. Over time, I developed methods that worked." "Methods," Vextar repeated. "You make it sound like you invented a new form of combat." "In a way I did, sir. Human children on frontier worlds often have to deal with bullies from other species. Traditional human martial arts aren't very effective against opponents with natural armor or extra limbs. So I studied anatomy text, observed movement patterns, and developed techniques specifically designed to work against non-human physiology." Vextar leaned back in his chair, his secondary eyes studying her while his primary eyes remained fixed on her file. "And you shared these techniques with other humans?" "Some of them, sir. Word spread among the human families on New Geneva. Parents started asking me to teach their children basic self-defense." "I see." Vextar closed the file and looked directly at her. "Chen, what I saw today has implications beyond simple sparring matches. If humans are developing combat techniques specifically designed to neutralize other coalition species, that raises questions about your species' long-term intentions." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Sir, with respect, those techniques were developed for self-defense, not aggression. Humans aren't planning some kind of military uprising." "Perhaps not consciously," Vextar said. "But evolution is a powerful force, Chen. Species adapt to their environments. If humans are adapting to survive in a galaxy full of physically superior aliens by becoming better at killing those aliens, well, that's something the coalition leadership needs to know about." Before Sarah could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the station. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside and Vextar's terminal lit up with urgent messages. "What the hell?" Vextar muttered, scanning the incoming data. His mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed the information. "We're under attack. Multiple Zentari vessels have just dropped out of hyperspace near the station." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Zentari were the Coalition's most dangerous enemy. A species of insectoid warriors whose hive mind tactics and biotechnology made them nearly unstoppable in direct combat. They took no prisoners and showed no mercy. "Sir, what are your orders?" Vextar was already moving, grabbing his armor and weapon from a wall locker. "All recruits are to report to the emergency shelters immediately. This is not a drill, and this is not a training exercise. Real Zentari are about to board this station, and they will kill anything that moves." As they rushed through the corridors toward the recruit barracks, Sarah could hear the sounds of battle growing closer. Energy weapons discharged in the distance and the station's hull shuddered under enemy fire. Emergency crews ran past them, heading toward damaged sections. The recruit barracks was in chaos when they arrived. New soldiers from a dozen species milled about in panic, some still struggling to understand what was happening. Sergeant Vextar's voice boomed over the noise. "Listen up, maggots. This station is under attack by Zentari forces. You are to proceed immediately to Emergency Shelter Alpha 7 and remain there until the all-clear is given. Do not attempt to help. Do not try to fight. You are not ready for real combat and you will only get in the way." As the recruits began filing toward the exit, another explosion rocked the station. The lights flickered, and Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive chittering sound of Zentari warriors somewhere in the nearby corridors. "They're already aboard," someone whispered. Suddenly, The main door to the barracks exploded inward. Through the smoke and debris came the nightmare forms of 3 Zentari warriors. Each stood nearly 8 feet tall, their chitinous black exoskeletons gleaming under the emergency lighting. Their multiple limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their compound eyes scanned the room with predatory intelligence. The recruits scattered in terror. Some tried to run for the emergency exits, others cowered behind overturned furniture. Sergeant Vextar stepped forward with his plasma rifle, but one of the creatures moved within human speed and knocked the weapon from his hands with a casual swipe. Sarah found herself pressed against a wall near the back of the room, watching in horror as the Zentari began their systematic slaughter. These weren't the controlled combat simulations she'd trained for. This was real death, real terror, real blood. Her battlefield mind kicked in automatically, analyzing the situation with cold precision. 3 enemies, approximately 40 potential victims, limited cover. No effective weapons readily available. The recruits' panic was making them easy targets. They were running in predictable patterns, clustering together, making noise that drew attention. One of the Zentari grabbed Zekthos as he tried to flee. The young Krillian's terrified screams filled the air as razor-sharp claws prepared to end his life. Sarah moved without conscious thought. Her small size allowed her to dart between overturned tables and debris without being noticed. She reached a wall locker that had been damaged in the explosion and grabbed a maintenance tool. Not much of a weapon, but it would have to do. The Zentari holding Zekthos had its back to her as it prepared to strike. Sarah's battlefield mind mapped its anatomy in an instant. The gaps in its exoskeleton, the positioning of its vital organs, the angle needed for maximum effectiveness. She struck with surgical precision, driving the improvised weapon into the creature's primary nerve cluster. The Zentari's limbs spasmed and released Zekthos, who collapsed to the floor gasping. But the creature wasn't dead. It spun toward Sarah with inhuman speed, its compound eyes fixing on her with murderous intent. For a moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the chaos of the barracks. Then Sarah smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the cold, calculating smile of someone who had just realized that all her theoretical knowledge was about to be put to the ultimate test. The Zentari might be the galaxy's perfect killers, but they had never faced a human who had spent years learning how to kill them. "Come on, then," she whispered, backing toward an area with more maneuvering room. "Let's see what you've got." The creature chittered what might have been laughter and began to advance, its multiple limbs moving in the coordinated patterns that had made its species the terror of 100 worlds. Sarah's battlefield mind cataloged every detail and began to plan. The Zentari warrior advanced with the confident stride of a predator that had never known defeat. Its 6 limbs moved in perfect coordination, claws extended, compound eyes tracking Sarah's every movement. Around the barracks, the sounds of battle continued as its companions hunted down the scattered recruits. Sarah backed away slowly, her mind racing through everything she knew about Zentari physiology. Unlike the other coalition species she'd studied, information about their enemies was classified and limited, but she'd managed to access some basic anatomical data during her research, and her battlefield mind was reconstructing those details now. Primary heart located in the upper thorax, secondary heart in the lower abdomen. Breathing spiracles along the sides of the torso, major nerve clusters at the base of the neck and between the shoulder joints, exoskeleton vulnerable at joint intersections but nearly impenetrable elsewhere. The creature lunged forward with surprising speed, its forward claws slashing through the air where Sarah had been standing a split second before. She rolled aside, grabbing a fallen piece of debris as she moved. The makeshift club wouldn't penetrate the creature's armor, but it might serve as a distraction. "You're fast," Sarah said conversationally, circling to keep furniture between herself and the alien. "But you're used to fighting opponents who match your strength, aren't you? You probably don't get much practice hunting mice." The Zentari chittered something that might have been amusement or annoyance. It feinted left, then struck right, its rear claws attempting to pin Sarah against a wall while its front limbs prepared to tear her apart. Sarah didn't try to avoid the attack entirely. Instead, she did something that no Zentari had ever encountered. She used their own momentum against them. As the creature lunged forward, she dropped low and drove the improvised club upward into the soft joint where its rear leg connected to its thorax. The impact wasn't enough to cause serious damage, but it was enough to throw off the creature's balance. As it stumbled, Sarah was already moving, scrambling up its back like a spider climbing a tree. Her small size and light weight meant the Zentari couldn't easily dislodge her without risking its own stability. From her perch on the creature's back, Sarah could reach the nerve cluster at the base of its neck. She drove her fingers into the gap between armor, plates, and applied pressure with everything. She'd learned about human anatomy and everything. She'd guessed about alien physiology. The Zentari's reaction was immediate and violent. Its entire body convulsed as neural signals misfired throughout its nervous system. It crashed to the floor, taking Sarah with it, but she rolled away as they hit the ground. The creature wasn't dead, but it was paralyzed from the neck down. Its compound eyes tracked Sarah's movement, filled with something that might have been confusion or respect. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, and she meant it. Then she grabbed a piece of sharp debris and ended the creature's suffering with a precise strike to its primary heart. When she stood up, she found the entire barracks staring at her in stunned silence. The other two Zentari had stopped their assault and were focused entirely on the small human who had just killed one of their companions with her bare hands. "Sergeant." Vextar slowly picked up his dropped weapon, his four eyes wide with disbelief. "Chen, what the hell did you just do?" "What I had to, sir," Sarah replied, wiping the creature's dark blood from her hands. Her voice was still calm, but there was something different about her now, a coldness that hadn't been there before. The remaining Zentari exchanged rapid, chittering sounds, apparently communicating about this unexpected development. Sarah couldn't understand their language, but their body language was clear enough. They were recalculating their approach. "Everybody stay back," Sarah called out to the other recruits. "Don't try to help, don't try to run. Just stay out of the way." "Chen, you can't fight two of them," Vextar said. "Fall back to my position. We'll make a stand together." Sarah shook her head. "No, sir. They're pack hunters. If we cluster together, they'll coordinate their attacks and overwhelm us. But if I keep them focused on me, you can evacuate the others." Before anyone could argue, the two remaining Zentari split up and began approaching from different angles. They'd learned from their companion's death and were no longer underestimating the small human. Sarah positioned herself in the center of the room where she had maximum maneuverability. Her battlefield mind was running at full capacity now, tracking both enemies simultaneously, calculating attack vectors and escape routes. The creature on her left struck first, its claws whistling through the air in a complex pattern, designed to force her into the path of its companion's attack. But Sarah had anticipated this. She dropped flat to the floor as the first set of claws passed overhead, then rolled sideways as the second creature's strike impacted where she'd been lying. As she came to her feet, Sarah grabbed a fallen piece of equipment and hurled it at the nearest creature's head, not to damage it but to obscure its vision for a critical second. In that moment, she closed the distance and struck at its breathing spiracles with a sharp piece of debris. The Zentari wheezed and stumbled, its respiratory system temporarily compromised. Sarah was already moving toward the second creature, which had recovered from its missed attack and was turning to face her. This one was more cautious, having seen what happened to its companions. It advanced slowly, testing her defenses with quick jabs rather than committing to full attacks. Sarah matched its patience, conserving her energy while looking for an opening. The breakthrough came when the first creature, still gasping for air, attempted to rejoin the fight. Its labored movements distracted its companion for just a moment, and Sarah struck like lightning. She dove between the second creature's legs, came up behind it, and used a broken chair leg to jam its rear breathing spiracles. As it turned to dislodge the obstruction, she was already attacking its wounded companion. The injured Zentari was easier prey. Sarah used her improvised weapons and superior mobility to systematically disable its limbs, striking at joints and nerve clusters until it could no longer coordinate its movements. When it finally collapsed, she finished it with the same clinical precision she'd shown the first. The last Zentari faced her alone, its compound eyes reflecting what might have been the first fear any of its species had ever experienced. This small, weak human had just killed two of the galaxy's most feared predators using nothing but intelligence, improvised weapons, and an understanding of anatomy that bordered on the supernatural. "Your move," Sarah said quietly. The creature chittered something that sounded almost like a question. Then, incredibly, it began to back away toward the damaged entrance. "It's retreating," someone whispered in amazement. Sarah didn't relax her guard. "No, it's regrouping. It's going to bring reinforcements. But before the Zentari could reach the exit, the cavalry arrived. Coalition Marines in full combat armor burst through the emergency entrances, their plasma weapons already charged and ready. The remaining creature was caught in a crossfire and eliminated within seconds. The lead Marine approached Sarah, his helmet's sensors scanning the scene of carnage. "Recruit, are you injured?" "No, sir," Sarah replied, though she was starting to feel the exhaustion and adrenaline crash. The Marine looked at the 3 dead Zentari, then at the small human covered in their blood. "Did you do this?" Before Sarah could answer, Sergeant Vexistar stepped forward. "She saved all our lives, Lieutenant. Killed 2 of them single-handed and drove off the 3rd. The Marine's helmet turned toward Sarah again, and she could feel his amazement even through the armor. "What's your name, recruit?" "Sarah Chen, sir." "Well, Chen," the Marine said slowly, "I think your training just took an interesting turn." News of the incident spread through the coalition military, faster than hyperspace communications. Within hours, Sarah Chen's name was being whispered in command centers across the galaxy. A human recruit had single-handedly killed 2 Zentari warriors and forced a 3rd to retreat, something that seasoned veterans with advanced weapons struggled to accomplish. But Sarah found herself isolated rather than celebrated. 3 days after the attack, she sat alone in the station's medical bay while doctors ran test after test, trying to understand how a small human had accomplished the impossible. Military intelligence officers questioned her for hours about her background, her training, and her methods. "The official report is being classified at the highest levels," Lieutenant Colonel Thane informed her during one of these sessions. The grizzled human officer had arrived from Coalition Command specifically to interview Sarah. "What you did has implications that reach far beyond a single battle." "I don't understand." "Sir," Sarah replied, "I defended myself and others. Isn't that what soldiers are supposed to do?" "Soldiers are supposed to follow orders and work within established tactical frameworks," Thane said. "What you did was develop and implement entirely new combat techniques against humanity's greatest enemy. Techniques that proved devastatingly effective." Thane activated a holographic display showing combat footage from the barracks. "Our analysts have studied this recording dozens of times. Every move you made was calculated, precise, and based on an understanding of Zentari physiology that shouldn't exist. You targeted specific anatomical weaknesses that aren't even mentioned in our classified intelligence reports." Sarah watched herself fighting the alien creatures, seeing the battle from an outside perspective for the first time. Her movements looked almost inhuman in their efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no fear. She barely recognized herself. "The question," Thane continued, "is whether you're an anomaly or whether you represent something larger. Are other humans developing similar capabilities? Is this some kind of evolutionary adaptation we haven't detected?" "I can't speak for all humans, sir," Sarah said carefully. "I can only tell you about my own experiences. And those experiences included developing combat techniques specifically designed to kill coalition species," Thane pointed out. "You've essentially created an assassination manual for taking down aliens." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications of what she'd done. Her childhood self-defense techniques, born from necessity and refined through study, could indeed be seen as something far more sinister. "Sir, with respect, those techniques were never intended for offensive use. They were survival tools." "Perhaps," Thane said, "but intentions can change. The Coalition Council is concerned about the precedent this sets. If humans can develop these capabilities independently, what happens when that knowledge spreads? What happens when it's weaponized?" Before Sarah could respond, alarms began blaring again. Red lights flashed throughout the medical bay and Thane's communicator erupted with urgent messages. "Another attack?" Sarah asked. Thane listened to his earpiece, his expression growing grave. "Worse. The Zentari have launched a full-scale assault on the Kepler 442 system. Multiple colony worlds are under siege, and our defensive fleets are being overwhelmed." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Kepler 442 was the same battle that would form the basis of her upcoming combat simulation. But this wasn't a test. This was real, and millions of lives hung in the balance. "Sir, I request permission to join the relief force," Sarah said. Thane stared at her in disbelief. "Chen, you're still a recruit. You haven't even completed basic training." I'm the only person in the Coalition military who has successfully killed Zentari in hand-to-hand combat, Sarah pointed out. That experience might be valuable. Absolutely not. The political implications alone would be— Colonel, Sarah interrupted something she would never have done before the attack. People are dying right now. Coalition forces are being slaughtered by an enemy they don't know how to fight effectively. I can't solve the larger strategic problems, but I might be able to help small unit tactics. Thane was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing priorities. Finally, he activated his communicator. Command, this is Thane. I need to speak with Admiral Morrison immediately. 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the station's main briefing room, facing a holographic projection of Admiral Morrison, the Coalition's supreme military commander. The elderly Etherian's translucent features were tight with stress. Colonel Thane tells me you want to join the Kepler 442 relief mission, Morrison said without preamble. That's highly irregular for a recruit. Yes, sir. But the situation seems to call for irregular solutions. Morrison studied her for a moment. I've read the reports about your encounter with the Zentari. Impressive work, though it raises troubling questions about human military development. Sir, if I may, those questions can be addressed after we save the colonies. A slight smile crossed the Admiral's features. Direct, I appreciate that. Very well, Chen. You'll be attached to the 7th Marine Assault Battalion as a special consultant. Your job will be to advise on close-quarters combat tactics against Zentari forces. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Morrison warned. This isn't a reward, it's a field test. If your techniques prove effective on a larger scale, it could change everything. If they don't, you'll likely die with the rest of your unit. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in the assault ship's armory being fitted for combat gear. The equipment felt strange and heavy compared to her training uniform, but she was grateful for the protection. Around her, Marines from a dozen species prepared their weapons and reviewed tactical data. Sergeant Major Kelrick, a massive Terran cybernetic veteran, approached her with obvious skepticism. So you're the miracle girl who killed 3 Zentari with her bare hands? 2, Sergeant Major, the third one retreated. Right. Kelrick's cybernetic eye whirred as it focused on her. Look, kid, I don't know what kind of special training you've had, but real combat isn't like the simulations. Down there, people die in ugly ways and heroes don't always win. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'm not trying to be a hero, Sergeant Major. I'm just trying to help people survive. Something in her tone made Kelrick reassess her. You've seen real death, haven't you? Not just training casualties. Yes, Sergeant Major. Good. That'll help keep you alive. He handed her a customized weapon harness. These are low-profile weapons designed for close-quarters work. If you're really going to fight these bugs up close, you'll need tools that won't get in your way. As the assault ship dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442, Sarah looked out at the tactical displays showing the battle in progress. Dozens of Zentari bioships swarmed around the human colonies like wasps around a hive. Coalition vessels fought desperately to hold them back, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Insertion in 30 minutes, came the announcement over the ship's speakers. All assault teams to final positions. Sarah checked her equipment one last time and tried to quiet the nervous energy building in her chest. Soon she would find out if her techniques could work on a battlefield rather than in a training room. She would discover whether Sarah Chen was truly the warrior others thought she was, or just a lucky recruit who had survived one impossible encounter. Either way, there was no turning back now. The drop pods screamed through Kepler 442's atmosphere like falling stars, carrying their cargo of desperate hope toward the embattled colony of New Manchester. Sarah's pod was cramped, shared with 3 other Marines who alternated between studying their tactical displays and stealing glances at the small human who had somehow become their secret weapon. 30 seconds to impact, announced the pod's AI. Brace for landing sequence. Through the pod's tiny viewport, Sarah could see the colony burning. Zentari bioships had deposited thousands of warriors throughout the settlement, and Coalition forces were being systematically overwhelmed. The aliens' hive mind coordination allowed them to execute complex maneuvers that human commanders couldn't predict or counter. The pod hit the ground with bone-jarring force, and its doors blew open immediately. Sarah and her team emerged into hell. New Manchester had been a peaceful farming community just hours ago. Now it was a war zone filled with smoke, screaming civilians, and the distinctive chittering of Centauri warriors. Bodies from multiple species lay scattered in the streets, and several buildings had been converted into alien nesting sites. Team 7, this is Command, crackled through their communicators. You're to proceed to the residential district and assist in civilian evacuation. Be advised, enemy concentration is heavy in that sector. Sergeant Major Kelrick took point, his enhanced sensors scanning for threats. Chen, you stay in the middle of the formation. If we encounter Zentari, you'll advise on tactics, but don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered if such caution was realistic. In her experience, encounters with the Zentari rarely allowed for careful planning and advisory roles. They moved through the colony's outer streets past abandoned vehicles and hastily constructed barricades. The silence was worse than battle sounds would have been. It suggested that the fighting had already moved past this area, leaving only death in its wake. Movement ahead, whispered Corporal Vega, a Krillian Marine whose forearms made him deadly with multiple weapons. Multiple contacts, definitely alien. Through the smoke, Sarah could see them, a hunting pack of 6 Zentari warriors methodically searching a residential complex. They moved with the fluid coordination that made them so dangerous, checking each building while maintaining perfect awareness of their teammates' positions. Standard engagement protocol would be to call for artillery support, Kelrick murmured, but that would level the entire block and there might be civilians in those buildings. There are civilians, Sarah said quietly, her enhanced senses picking up faint sounds from the complex. I can hear at least a dozen people hiding in the basement levels. How can you possibly? Vega began, then stopped. The reports about human sensory capabilities were apparently more accurate than he'd believed. So what's your recommendation, Chen? Kelrick asked. How do we take out 6 Zentari without bringing down the building? Sarah studied the aliens' movement patterns through her scope. They were following standard Zentari tactics. Systematic, thorough, coordinated. But those same patterns created predictable vulnerabilities if you knew what to look for. They're hunting in a standard hexagonal formation, she said. It's designed to cover maximum area while maintaining mutual support. But it has a critical weakness. If you can disrupt their coordination, the formation becomes a liability instead of an asset. How do we disrupt it? By making them think there are threats where there aren't any, and no threats where there are. Sarah pointed to several positions around the complex. If we can create distractions at these points, they'll reorganize to investigate. During the transition, individual warriors will be temporarily isolated. Kelrick considered this. You're talking about turning their strengths against them. Exactly. Their hive mind coordination is incredibly effective, but it depends on accurate information. Feed it false data, and the whole system becomes confused. All right, Kelrick decided. We'll try it your way. Vega, Ramirez, you take positions here and here. Create noise and movement, but don't actually engage. Make them think you're a larger force preparing to attack from multiple directions. The plan unfolded with surgical precision. The Marines created carefully orchestrated distractions, while Sarah positioned herself at the optimal intercept point. When the Zentari began reorganizing their formation to deal with the apparent threats, she struck. The first warrior died before it realized what was happening. Sarah's enhanced reflexes and intimate knowledge of alien anatomy allowed her to disable its primary nervous system with a single precise strike. The second fell to a combination of pressure point attacks and improvised weapons, but killing 2 wasn't enough. The remaining 4 were already adapting, their hive mind processing the new threat and developing countermeasures. Sarah found herself facing the nightmarish prospect of 4 coordinated Zentari warriors who now knew exactly how dangerous she was. Chen, fall back, Kelrick shouted. Don't try to take them all. But Sarah was already moving, her battlefield mind calculating angles and probabilities within human speed. She couldn't retreat. The moment she broke contact, the aliens would reorganize and become exponentially more dangerous. Her only option was to press the attack and maintain the initiative. She moved like liquid shadow through the complex, using her small size and intimate knowledge of human architecture to stay ahead of the pursuing aliens. But she wasn't just running. She was leading them into carefully prepared positions where the environment itself became a weapon. The third Zentari died when Sarah collapsed a weakened stairwell beneath its feet. then struck its exposed nerve clusters while it was trapped in the debris. The fourth fell to a combination of electrical systems and improvised explosive devices that Sarah jury-rigged from maintenance equipment. By the time Kelrick and his team reached her position, only 2 Zentari remained, and they were clearly reconsidering their tactics. For the first time in recorded military history, Zentari warriors were retreating from a ground engagement against a numerically inferior force. "How many?" Kelrick asked, surveying the carnage. 4 confirmed kills, Sarah reported, checking her equipment for damage. 2 retreated toward the colony center. 4, Vega repeated in amazement. She killed 4 Zentari in less than 10 minutes, and saved at least 12 civilians, added Private Ramirez, helping evacuate the families they'd found hiding in the basements. But Sarah wasn't celebrating. Her battlefield mind was already analyzing the larger tactical situation, and what she saw was troubling. "Sergeant Major, the retreating warriors will report back to their hive mind. They'll adapt their tactics to counter what they've learned about human capabilities." "What does that mean?" "It means we have a limited window before they figure out how to neutralize my techniques. We need to use that window to maximum advantage." Kelrick activated his communicator. "Command, this is Team 7. We've successfully cleared the residential complex, but we need to discuss tactical adjustments based on Chen's performance." "Understood, Team 7. What's your assessment?" Sarah took the communicator. "Sir, we're dealing with an adaptive enemy that learns from each encounter. My techniques are effective, but only as long as they remain unpredictable. I recommend immediate deployment of similar tactics across all ground units before the Zentari develop countermeasures." There was a long pause. "Chen, are you saying you want to teach an entire army how to fight like you do?" Sarah looked around at the destruction surrounding them, at the bodies of civilians and soldiers alike, at the fear in her teammates' eyes. "Sir, I'm saying that if we don't, we're going to lose this war." "Stand by for new orders," Command said finally. "You're about to get very busy, Chen." 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood before the Coalition War Council in the heart of Command Central, no longer the uncertain recruit who had first stepped onto the GSC Vengeance. The small conference room held representatives from every major species in the Coalition, their attention focused entirely on the young human who had changed the course of the war. "The results speak for themselves," Admiral Morrison announced, activating the holographic display. "Casualty rates against Zentari forces have dropped by 67% since implementation of the Chen protocols. More significantly, we've achieved our first strategic victories against Centauri invasion fleets in over 3 years." The display showed battle statistics from dozens of worlds where coalition forces had employed Sarah's techniques. What had once been hopeless last stands had become tactical victories. Zentari forces that had seemed unstoppable were now retreating from systems they had previously conquered with ease. "The psychological impact has been equally significant," added General Thexlaran, a Krillian strategist whose own species had adopted Sarah's methods with particular enthusiasm. "Zentari forces are showing signs of hesitation and uncertainty for the first time in recorded history. Their hive mind appears to be struggling to process the concept of systematic defeat." Sarah remained silent during the presentations, her mind focused on implications that reached far beyond military statistics. She had become something she'd never intended to be, not just a soldier, but a symbol of humanity's potential in a hostile galaxy. "However," interjected Counselor Wei Shan, an Etherian diplomat whose telepathic abilities made her naturally suspicious of human intentions, "we must address the broader concerns that these developments have raised. The Chen protocols represent more than just new tactics. They represent a fundamental shift in the military balance between species." The room fell silent as the real issue was finally brought into the open. Sarah's techniques hadn't just proven effective against the Zentari, they worked against every coalition species as well. Humans had essentially developed the ability to kill any alien they encountered with devastating efficiency. "The question before us," Veishan continued, "is whether we can trust a species that has demonstrated such capabilities to remain our allies, rather than become our conquerors." Ambassador Harrison, the senior human representative, leaned forward. "Counselor, with respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that led to the current crisis. Humans developed these techniques out of necessity, not aggression. We shared them freely with all coalition forces instead of keeping them secret. Perhaps, Vaishon replied, but intentions can change. What happens when humanity decides it no longer needs the coalition? What happens when your species realizes it has the power to dominate rather than cooperate? Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed through months of combat and training.
Counselor, may I address that concern directly?
Please do. Sarah stood and activated her own holographic display, showing footage from recent battles. These techniques work because they exploit weaknesses that exist in all carbon-based life forms. But they also require specific knowledge, training, and mindset that most humans don't possess. She highlighted several key moments from the recordings. What you're seeing isn't humanity becoming some kind of super warrior species. You're seeing the results of specific individuals who have been trained in very particular methods. Without that training, most humans are no more dangerous than they ever were. But the knowledge exists now, pointed out General Karthik, a military leader whose own forces had suffered heavy losses before adopting Sarah's methods. It can be spread, weaponized, turned against former allies. Yes, it can, Sarah agreed. Just like any military technology. But consider the alternative. Without these techniques, the Zentari would have conquered the entire coalition within 2 years. We'd all be dead or enslaved. She manipulated the display to show projected casualty figures. Every species in this room has benefited from these methods. Krillian warriors are now capable of defeating Zentari in single combat. Etherian telepaths have learned to disrupt hive mind coordination. Even our most peaceful member species have developed defensive capabilities they never had before. Admiral Morrison nodded approvingly. Chen's point is valid. The techniques have been adapted by every coalition military, not just human forces. The knowledge belongs to all of us now. Which brings us to the real question, Counselor Vaishon said. What happens next? The war against the Zentari is essentially won. Their forces are in full retreat, and our intelligence suggests their hive worlds are preparing for a defensive siege rather than continued expansion. So what role does humanity play in the post-war galaxy? Sarah felt the weight of that question. She'd gone from being a mocked recruit to being the person who might determine humanity's place among the stars. The answer she gave here would affect billions of lives across thousands of worlds. Counselor, I think you're asking the wrong question, she said finally. You're worried about what humans might do to other species. But maybe you should be asking what we can do together that none of us could accomplish alone. She changed the display again, showing star charts of unexplored space beyond coalition borders. The galaxy is vast and we've barely scratched its surface. There are probably other threats out there. Threats that might make the Zentari look like a minor inconvenience. Shouldn't we be preparing for those challenges instead of fighting among ourselves? An interesting perspective, Admiral Morrison said. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we treat this as a beginning rather than an ending, Sarah replied. The Chen protocols prove that different species can share knowledge and techniques to become stronger together. What if we expanded that concept beyond military applications? She highlighted several research stations and exploration vessels on the star charts. Human analytical thinking combined with Krillian strength, Etherian telepathy, and Terran engineering. Not as separate species competing for resources, but as a unified civilization exploring and defending the galaxy together. The room was quiet for several minutes as the various representatives considered her words. Finally, Counselor Vaishon spoke. You're asking us to trust not just in humanity's good intentions, but in our ability to transcend the tribal instincts that have driven galactic politics for millennia. I'm asking you to recognize that we've already started, Sarah said. Every coalition soldier who learned my techniques had to trust that I wasn't teaching them how to be vulnerable to human attack. Every human instructor who taught these methods to alien forces had to trust that the knowledge wouldn't be used against our own species. She gestured to the assembled representatives. We're all here in the same room discussing the future instead of preparing for war against each other. That trust already exists. The question is whether we're brave enough to build on it. Admiral Morrison stood slowly. The War Council will need time to discuss these proposals. But I want to say something on the record. He looked directly at Sarah. 6 months ago, Recruit Chen was a young human that most people expected to wash out of basic training. Today, she's changed the balance of power in the galaxy and possibly saved our civilization. That transformation didn't happen in isolation. It happened because the Coalition gave her the opportunity to grow and contribute. He turned to address the full council. If we can produce that kind of result with one supposedly insignificant recruit, imagine what we might accomplish if we truly commit to working together. I, for one, think it's worth finding out. As the formal session ended and representatives began filing out, Sergeant Vextar approached Sarah. The massive Krillian had requested to attend the meeting specifically to see how his former recruit would handle the pressure. "Well, Chen," he said, "I believe I owe you an apology." Sarah smiled, the first genuine, relaxed expression she'd shown all day. "No, sir. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You tested me, challenged me, and helped me become stronger. That's what good sergeants do." "Perhaps," Vextar replied, "but I think I underestimated what stronger could mean." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, I'm proud to have trained you." As Sarah left the council chambers, she caught her reflection in the polished metal walls. The uncertain young woman who had once been mocked by her fellow recruits was gone, replaced by someone who had found her place in the galaxy through necessity, determination, and the kind of courage that came from protecting others rather than seeking glory. Her name would indeed become a nightmare, but not for the coalition forces who had once dismissed her. The Chen protocols had become the stuff of legend among Zentari survivors, a whispered warning about the small human who had taught an entire galaxy how to kill the unkillable. But Sarah preferred a different legacy. In training facilities across the coalition, instructors from dozens of species were teaching young soldiers that size didn't determine strength, that knowledge could overcome raw power, and that working together could achieve the impossible. That, she thought, was a much better nightmare to be remembered for.